July 18, 1944, 9:30 a.m., Tokyo, Imperial General Headquarters. Prime Minister and Army Minister Hideki Tojo is seated at a conference table as senior staff officers present the latest consolidated intelligence from Europe. The reports confirm that Allied forces have secured a permanent foothold in Normandy and that German counterattacks have failed to contain the invasion. What is being delivered is not a single battlefield update, but a strategic conclusion. Germany no longer has the capacity to divert Allied strength away from the Pacific War. For nearly 3 years, Japan's senior leadership had assumed that Germany's conflict with Britain, the Soviet Union, and now the United States would impose limits on how much force America could deploy against Japan. That assumption had shaped everything from naval construction schedules to estimates of how long Japan could hold its outer defensive perimeter. By July 1944, that calculation was collapsing. The intelligence summaries describe American divisions landing in France in numbers that Germany cannot match, air superiority firmly in Allied hands, and German reserves committed without decisive effect. Inside the room, the meaning is clear even before it is spoken. The European war is no longer constraining the Pacific one. Emperor Hirohito is briefed separately later that day. The tone of the report is restrained, but the substance is unmistakable. Germany's position is described as gravely deteriorated, with no indication that the Western Allies can be forced back into the sea. For the Emperor, whose role had increasingly become one of absorbing unfiltered assessments, this marks a turning point. The strategic framework of the Axis partnership had rested on simultaneous pressure in multiple theaters. If Germany cannot sustain that pressure, Japan's war becomes isolated by default. Within the Japanese High Command, the collapse of Germany's prospects forces a reassessment that many officers had postponed. Since 1941, coordination with Berlin had been limited by distance and distrust, but Germany's very existence as a fighting power had been useful. As long as German armies remained engaged in Europe, Japan could argue that time might still work in its favor. Now, time appears to be aligning exclusively with the United States. American shipyards are producing carriers faster than Japan can replace losses. Aircrew training pipelines favor quantity and survivability over experience alone. With Germany failing to hold ground in France, there is no longer any reason to expect a reduction in American output or focus. The political consequences follow quickly. On the same day the intelligence briefings are circulated, pressure on Tojo intensifies. His authority has been eroding since the fall of Saipan weeks earlier, which brought American bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. The news from Europe removes one of the last arguments for his continued leadership, that Japan's alliance structure still offers strategic balance. By evening, it is evident that Tojo's position is untenable. He resigns not because Germany has fallen, but because Germany's failure has stripped his strategy of credibility. Across the military bureaucracy, officers begin adjusting their language. Planning documents no longer refer to combined Axis pressure. References to German technological assistance, already minimal by 1944, disappear almost entirely. Submarine exchanges of materials and blueprints, once discussed as future possibilities, are now treated as irrelevant. The war is increasingly described in internal memoranda as a contest between Japan and the United States alone. This shift does not produce consensus, but it narrows the range of acceptable assumptions. Adolf Hitler's name still appears in reports, but more as a data point than as a partner. Japanese observers note changes in German command structure, emergency mobilizations, and public speeches emphasizing total resistance. These details are recorded carefully, but without optimism. The German leader's insistence on fighting without retreat is recognized, but it no longer reassures. In Tokyo, resolve without capacity is understood as a warning, not a model. For Japanese naval planners, the implications are immediate. Any hope that American carrier groups might be divided between oceans is gone. The Central Pacific, already lost in stages, will not be reinforced by events elsewhere. Defensive planning turns inward, focusing on attrition and delay rather than reversal. The Army, long dominant in national strategy, confronts the same conclusion from a different angle. No land victory in Asia can offset industrial defeat at sea. Among civilian officials and diplomats, the news from Europe intensifies private anxiety. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, reviewing the same intelligence, understands that Germany's decline removes diplomatic leverage as well as military distraction. Neutral mediation through European channels becomes less plausible. The war's diplomatic horizon narrows alongside its strategic one. By nightfall on July 18th, the day's meaning has settled across Tokyo's leadership. Germany is still fighting, still resisting, but it can no longer shape outcomes beyond its own front. For Japan, the alliance that once promised shared burdens has become a formality without function. The war ahead will be fought without relief, without diversion, and without the strategic shelter that Europe once provided. What remains uncertain is not whether Japan is alone, but how its leaders will respond to that knowledge. In the years before Germany's decline became undeniable, the alliance between Berlin and Tokyo had already been constrained by distance and suspicion. When Japan signed the Tripartite Pact in September 1940, the agreement committed each power to support the others if attacked by a nation not already at war. It did not require shared planning, unified command, or synchronized operations. From the outset, the partnership was political rather than operational, built on parallel interests rather than integrated strategy. Adolf Hitler viewed Japan primarily as a force that could complicate American calculations in the Pacific. His attention remained fixed on Europe, where the defeat of Britain and the Soviet Union was central to German objectives. Japan, for its part, pursued its own imperial ambitions in East and Southeast Asia, shaped by resource needs and long-standing conflicts with China. Communication between the two capitals was irregular and filtered through layers of mistrust. Even basic intelligence sharing was limited, often delayed by weeks or months due to the absence of secure, direct routes. The physical separation between Germany and Japan was not merely an inconvenience, it defined the alliance's limits. The vast distances between Europe and East Asia meant that any material exchange had to pass through hostile waters or neutral intermediaries. German technology transfers, often cited as evidence of cooperation, were rare and uneven. A small number of submarines attempted long voyages to exchange blueprints, samples, or specialists. But these efforts were dangerous and sporadic. Losses were high, and the impact on Japan's war effort was marginal. Within Japan's military leadership, expectations about Germany were shaped more by hope than by evidence. Some officers believed that German advances in Europe would inevitably force Britain and the United States into defensive postures, reducing pressure on Japan's expanding perimeter. Others were more cautious, noting that Germany's war aims did not align with Japan's need for sustained naval distraction. These doubts rarely surfaced in public statements, but they circulated quietly within staff discussions. The lack of coordination was most evident at critical moments. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Germany declared war on the United States days later, but without prior consultation or joint planning. The decision suited Hitler's ideological view of the conflict, but did not translate into practical support for Japan. American industrial capacity, once fully mobilized, proved capable of sustaining large-scale operations in both Europe and the Pacific simultaneously. The assumption that the United States would be forced to choose proved false. By 1943, the imbalance was obvious. Germany was consuming vast resources fighting on the Eastern Front, while Japan struggled to replace ships, aircraft, and trained crews lost in the Pacific. Requests for advanced German weapons designs, including jet propulsion research and anti-aircraft systems, were acknowledged but rarely fulfilled in usable form. Even when information arrived, Japan lacked the industrial base to implement it at scale under wartime conditions. Hideki Tojo, during his tenure as Prime Minister, continued to speak publicly of Axis unity, but internal assessments were more guarded. Reports from military attachés in Europe described a German war effort under increasing strain, reliant on emergency measures and diminishing reserves. These observations did not immediately alter Japanese strategy, but they weakened confidence in the alliance as a source of future advantage. Emperor Hirohito's awareness of these limitations grew steadily. Briefings emphasized that Germany and Japan were fighting fundamentally different wars against the same enemy. Germany's struggle was continental and industrial, Japan's maritime and logistical. The absence of a shared operational framework meant that success or failure in one theater did not translate into direct effects in the other. The alliance provided political symbolism, but little else. As Germany's position deteriorated in 1944, the realization hardened within Japan's leadership that the partnership had reached its practical end. What had once been framed as a combined struggle against Western powers was now understood as two separate wars connected only by rhetoric. The collapse of Germany's ability to influence Allied deployments forced Japanese planners to confront an uncomfortable truth. The alliance had delayed recognition of Japan's isolation rather than prevented it. This understanding did not immediately produce consensus or clarity. Some leaders argued that Japan had never depended on Germany in the first place and could continue fighting on its own terms. Others recognized that the alliance's failure had masked deeper structural weaknesses. As the European front closed in on Germany, Japan's war effort stood exposed, sustained by ideology and resolve, but no longer by expectation of outside relief. By the autumn of 1944, the Japanese High Command no longer discussed Germany as a factor in future planning. Internal assessments now treated the European war as a closed system, moving toward a conclusion that Japan could not influence. Reports arriving through diplomatic and intelligence channels described German forces retreating on multiple fronts, fuel shortages crippling mobility, and air defenses overwhelmed by sustained Allied bombing. These were no longer warnings. They were confirmations that the Axis balance had irreversibly shifted. At Imperial General Headquarters, planning conferences reflected a narrowing strategic horizon. Without Germany tying down American resources, Japan faced the full weight of United States industrial and military power. The Pacific War was no longer one theater of a global conflict, but a singular contest in which Japan's capacity was declining and America's was expanding. The consequences were tangible. Shipbuilding targets were revised downward, aircraft production plans adjusted to account for shortages of aluminum and trained pilots, and expectations of technological breakthroughs were quietly abandoned. General Yoshijiro Umezu, Chief of the Army General Staff, reviewed projections that no longer included external relief. Earlier assumptions that Germany might force negotiations in Europe, or at least prolong the war long enough to exhaust Allied public support, were removed from the models entirely. The revised estimates were stark. American forces would continue advancing across the Central and Western Pacific without interruption. There would be no pause created by crises elsewhere. Diplomatic channels offered no alternative. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo evaluated the possibility of mediation through neutral states, but Germany's collapse undermined those efforts as well. European governments that might once have served as intermediaries were now either occupied, defeated, or aligned firmly with the Allies. The Soviet Union, still neutral toward Japan at this stage, was increasingly viewed as an uncertain factor rather than a reliable counterweight. Germany's decline removed one of the few pressures discouraging Soviet intervention in the Far East. Within the military leadership, disagreement intensified over how to respond to this isolation. Some officers argued that Japan should concentrate all remaining resources on a decisive defense of the home islands, inflicting such losses that the United States might reconsider the cost of invasion. Others questioned whether prolonging the war without allies served any strategic purpose beyond preserving institutional honor. These debates were conducted cautiously, often indirectly, but the underlying tension was unmistakable. Emperor Hirohito continued to receive detailed briefings that reflected this division. He was informed that Germany's inability to deliver weapons, intelligence, or diplomatic support meant Japan's war aims would have to be redefined. The emphasis shifted toward defending national survival rather than achieving victory. Even so, no consensus emerged on what survival should mean in practical terms or how it could be secured under existing conditions. Operationally, the absence of Germany translated into immediate vulnerabilities. American submarines tightened their blockade, severing remaining supply lines from Southeast Asia. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft and immobilized naval units. Training programs shortened further, producing pilots with fewer hours and less experience. These were not temporary setbacks awaiting relief. They were cumulative losses with no prospect of replacement. The psychological effect of this isolation was as significant as the material one. For years, Japanese leaders had framed the war as part of a global struggle against Western dominance. With Germany's collapse, that narrative lost coherence. The conflict increasingly appeared as a bilateral war against a single opponent whose resources dwarfed Japan's own. Maintaining morale under those conditions required an emphasis on duty and sacrifice that left little room for strategic flexibility. Adolf Hitler's continued calls for total resistance, relayed through diplomatic reporting, were noted but no longer influential. Japanese officers recognized the parallel but also the difference. Germany's industrial base and geographic position allowed for prolonged defense even in retreat. Japan's island geography and dependence on maritime supply made sustained resistance far more precarious. The lesson drawn was not inspiration, but caution. As 1945 approached, planning documents reflected a grim acceptance that no reinforcements were coming from Germany or anywhere else. The war would be decided by Japan's own choices, made under conditions of extreme constraint. Whether those choices would prioritize continued resistance or seek an exit remained unresolved. What was clear was that the strategic shelter once provided by the Axis alliance had vanished, leaving Japan to confront the consequences alone. When Germany formally surrendered in early May 1945, the information reached Tokyo through diplomatic and intelligence channels with no ambiguity attached. The war in Europe was over. For Japan's leadership, this was not a surprise, but its finality removed the last remaining abstraction from their strategic reality. There was no longer any pretense of a divided enemy or shared burden. The conflict ahead belonged solely to Japan and the United States. At Imperial General Headquarters, the surrender confirmed what months of planning had already assumed. Operational directives issued after May made no reference to Allied coordination or external developments. Every assessment was now framed around American capabilities alone. The United States Navy controlled the sea lanes. American air forces operated with near impunity over Japanese territory. Industrial output in North America continued to grow, while Japan's own production contracted under blockade and bombardment. General Yoshijiro Umezu and his counterparts in the Army General Staff focused on preparations for a decisive battle on the home islands. The logic was straightforward. Without allies and without the capacity to project power outward, Japan's remaining leverage lay in its ability to impose costs on an invading force. Defensive plans emphasized mass mobilization, layered fortifications, and the use of remaining air and naval units in concentrated strikes. These preparations were made despite awareness that material shortages limited their effectiveness. Emperor Hirohito received increasingly direct briefings on the consequences of Germany's surrender. Advisors acknowledged that Japan now faced the full application of American military doctrine without distraction. They reported that the United States had the capacity to conduct sustained operations indefinitely. The question was no longer whether Japan could win, but how long it could continue to fight, and under what conditions it might end the war. Within the leadership, ideological commitment and fear of internal collapse reinforced one another. Many officers believed that surrender without decisive resistance would undermine the legitimacy of the state and the military itself. The absence of Germany removed the external frame that had once justified sacrifice as part of a global struggle. In its place stood a narrower rationale rooted in national survival and institutional continuity. For some, this reinforced the need to fight. For others, it raised doubts that could not be voiced openly. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo continued to examine diplomatic options, but Germany's surrender had narrowed those avenues further. With Europe stabilized under Allied control, there were fewer neutral intermediaries with influence or urgency. The Soviet Union remained formally at peace with Japan, but its intentions were increasingly uncertain. Germany's defeat freed Soviet forces and altered the strategic balance in East Asia, introducing a new variable that Japan could not control. On the ground, the effects of fighting alone were visible across the country. Air raids intensified, targeting transportation networks, factories, and urban centers. Civil defense measures strained under the scale of destruction. Military units reported dwindling supplies and declining readiness. These conditions reinforced the leadership's sense of urgency, but also highlighted the limits of continued resistance. Despite these realities, the decision to continue the war reflected more than calculation. Institutional loyalty, personal responsibility, and concern for post-war judgment weighed heavily on senior figures. Many had committed themselves to the war when allies still stood beside them. Now, with Germany gone, the burden of accountability rested entirely on Japan's own command structure. Ending the war would require accepting that responsibility without the cover of alliance or shared failure. Emperor Hirohito's position evolved under this pressure. While he had long been informed of the war's deteriorating prospects, Germany's surrender clarified the isolation Japan faced. Discussions around him increasingly acknowledged that continued fighting would not alter the strategic outcome. Yet even as this understanding deepened, the path toward ending the war remained obstructed by unresolved questions of authority, process, and consequence. As May turned into June, Japan's leadership operated within a narrowing corridor of options. Germany's absence meant there would be no external event to shift the balance or change the equation. Every additional day of war was a choice made without illusion. The final decisions would have to be taken in full awareness that Japan stood alone and that the war's end would reflect its own judgment rather than the collapse of an alliance. By the summer of 1945, Japan's senior leadership no longer framed discussions around victory or reversal. Germany's absence had eliminated any remaining external reference point. The language used inside Imperial General Headquarters reflected this change. Briefings were no longer comparative or conditional. They addressed consequences, limits, and responsibility. The war was discussed as a problem to be resolved, not a struggle to be won. Emperor Hirohito's conferences with military and civilian leaders became increasingly focused on outcomes rather than operations. Reports described the cumulative effects of blockade, air raids, and material depletion in concrete terms. There were no projections of relief, no scenarios involving Allied intervention. The emperor was informed that Japan's capacity to continue the war was diminishing rapidly and irreversibly. Germany's surrender had removed any expectation that time or external pressure might alter that trajectory. Within these meetings, the language of obligation shifted. Earlier references to shared Axis resistance disappeared. Responsibility was framed as internal and national. Senior officers spoke of duty to the state, but also of accountability for decisions already taken. The absence of Germany meant there was no longer a partner with whom failure could be shared. The consequences of surrender or continued resistance would belong solely to Japan's leadership. General Yoshijiro Umezu and other members of the Army General Staff continued to emphasize the necessity of preserving order and cohesion. They warned that abrupt capitulation could produce internal instability and undermine the military's authority. These concerns were presented not as ideological positions, but as assessments of risk. At the same time, they acknowledged that continued fighting would inflict further damage without altering the strategic outcome. The contradiction was not resolved. It was managed through careful language and delayed decisions. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo's contributions reflected the narrowing diplomatic landscape. With Germany defeated, there was no longer a European conflict to leverage in negotiations. His assessment stressed that Japan's isolation had become absolute. Any settlement would have to be reached directly or through limited channels, with no expectation of external support. This reality sharpened the urgency of internal agreement, but also heightened fear of the consequences. Adolf Hitler's death and the collapse of the German state were discussed briefly and without elaboration. They were treated as confirmation rather than cause. The lesson drawn was not ideological, but practical. Germany's insistence on fighting until collapse had resulted in total occupation and loss of sovereignty. For Japanese leaders, this example carried weight precisely because it came from a former ally whose fate could no longer be abstracted or rationalized. As deliberations continued, the emperor's role became more central. He listened to assessments that acknowledged the war's futility while outlining the risks of ending it. Germany's absence meant that the decision could no longer be deferred by reference to alliance dynamics or external developments. The responsibility rested entirely within the Japanese system of authority. This concentration of responsibility clarified the moral stakes as much as the strategic ones. The language used in these final discussions avoided dramatization. It focused on preservation, survival, and the future of the nation beyond the war. The question was no longer how to defeat the enemy, but how to end the conflict without destroying the foundations of the state. Germany's collapse served as a constant reference point, not as a warning delivered from outside, but as a conclusion already observed. When the decision to surrender finally emerged, it was framed as an act taken in recognition of reality rather than defeat imposed by allies or enemies. The absence of Germany stripped away the last protective narrative. Japan's leaders could no longer attribute the war's outcome to collective failure or broken partnership. What remained was an acknowledgement that the war had become Japan's alone, and that its end would reflect Japan's own judgment. In that recognition lay the final consequence of Germany's collapse.